In this video, what I hope to do is give you a bit of a recap, a look at all of the recent news around Cyberpunk 2077. I want to touch on the recent controversy that you probably heard about having to do with microtransactions. I know I'm a couple of days late on that one, but I think I have a little bit of a unique perspective in explaining why it is so stupid. But we'll talk a little bit about that. Although otherwise, one of the real reasons I wanted to make this video is separately, CD Projekt Red and Cyberpunk 2077 kind of just capped off their press run, going to some of the major conferences or even holding their own little conferences. And as such, at the end of this, we actually got a plethora of details around the game, many involving in-game features and functionality, a lot of which sounds really cool, but also just broader details about some of the development or where they stand production-wise. If you enjoy the content or just want to see more in the way of Cyberpunk 2077, I do encourage you guys to subscribe. I should have some special stuff coming in the next few weeks. But without further ado, taking a step away from that, let's first look at this recent controversy that Cyberpunk has found itself at the center of. So a bit of background on this one, Cyberpunk 2077 is getting a multiplayer mode at some point. We don't know too much about this mode, just that it is in some form in production, a separate studio within CD Projekt is working on it, and it's not going to launch with the larger game of Cyberpunk. On release, it'll just be a single player experience in the typical fashion, but at a later point, this separate multiplayer mode will release. Just recently, CD Projekt Red actually had a kind of earnings or financial call. They are a publicly traded company, so they do this to just discuss some of the happenings from a financial perspective, but also what investors can expect going forward. During that call, investors did have the opportunity to ask a variety of questions, and this multiplayer mode came up, of course, also being followed by questions about its monetization. And during this, it was seemingly discussed how they are planning microtransactions for this mode. And following that news going live, most of it being on one Polish website, but that makes sense because CD Projekt Red is a Polish company, it seemed as if the internet collectively freaked out a bit around this, many doing a 180 on their trust of CD Projekt and how they're developing games. Microtransactions are naturally a pretty bad word nowadays. Except the reality of this situation is no, that didn't happen. Yes, there was an earnings call. Yes, there was discussion about the multiplayer mode and its monetization, but literally the word microtransaction was never said. Technically, what was stated in the article in Polish translates to micropayments, but taken with context, they were referring to microtransactions. After this blew up, the article actually was updated with a little message at the top describing how, in fact, no, microtransactions weren't mentioned. In reality, what was stated during that earnings call was more that the multiplayer mode, as well as whatever strategies they may use to monetize it, are still at an early stage. So nothing's concrete right now. They're still considering what exactly this will look like. But CD Projekt Red did clarify this, actually saying, well, this.
Yeah, and as far as the monetization on the multiplayer for Cyberpunk is concerned, we believe right now it's definitely too early to share any details on that or give guidance. The project is in relatively early stage. We keep experimenting. That's our first multiplayer game, and we check different options and possibilities, and it's definitely not the time to point you to a certain specific direction on that.
Yes, but you can expect that we won't change our general policy toward deals with gamers, so expect wise monetization and always value for money.
So to recap, all that was actually said was that Cyberpunk 2077's multiplayer mode and its monetization strategy are still at the early phase of development, and that while they're considering some of these monetization techniques, they're trying to stay kind of fair and true to the players, providing valuable products in return for payment. So in reality, microtransactions aren't confirmed or disconfirmed. Maybe, but also maybe not. I mean, granted that it is an online multiplayer game, it seems likely that microtransactions would come to it. That is a pretty common form of monetization for that. But again, as of right now, we don't really know. We don't really know much of anything about this multiplayer mode, whether it's co-op, full-on GTA Online style multiplayer, or something else entirely. Although the part about this that I found so astonishing was that it was actually fairly easy to verify. The original source article for a lot of this, although being in Polish, was actually translating English. They're translating English to Polish, and then people are translating that back into English. A lot of this controversy or a lot of the story here could have just been avoided if people went to the original source, which I just played you, that is totally in English. So that's, for the time being at least, what is actually happening around that, although pretty interesting. Something separate that isn't getting quite as much attention, but that was also revealed in this, is that currently there's no plans for VR with Cyberpunk. CD Projekt Red still views that as kind of a niche product, so maybe it comes at some point, but at least as of right now, it's not a focus for them. Although separately, as far as the development of this game overall goes, we recently did learn that Cyberpunk 2077 has entered into the final phase of development, specifically saying that now they're really focusing on language localization. So that is quite exciting. Hopefully that leaves a lot of time for further polish or testing, ensuring we get a pretty quality product, although I think a lot of us do expect that'll be the case. But then the other part of this video that I was pretty excited to talk about are a lot of other miscellaneous gameplay details about Cyberpunk 2077 itself. Just recently, CD Projekt Red held a yearly fan event. They do this almost every year, and at this year, they got to see some gameplay of Cyberpunk 2077, but also there was a Q&A at the end where we get a lot of pretty important and vital details. Although this one is a little bit more unique, I think some of the answers and information we get from here is better because, again, it was a fan event. They even had quizzes on the lore of Cyberpunk, so it seems like the people here are really following the game. They probably know all of those intimate or more specific details, so the questions in my eyes were quite a bit better. Although something very important to keep in mind with this one, due to it being a more fan event, I'm not reporting on some of these answers from an official news source. It rather is a Reddit post, and typically I wouldn't cover this, but on one of the responses to the post, we do see a response from the global community lead from CD Projekt, who seemingly was at the event but also read the post. So with that in mind, I have to imagine if there was any true or extremely gross inaccuracies, he would have commented on that. But again, since it is a fan post, take it somewhat with a grain of salt, although I do have quite a bit of confidence in this one. It doesn't seem totally made up. One of the first things that was discussed was the main story of Cyberpunk 2077, and actually, in fact, how it's slightly shorter than that of The Witcher 3, which at first glance sounds like a bad thing, but in reality, it's reported to also be significantly more replayable than the story of The Witcher 3. The example that CD Projekt was said to give was that The Witcher 3's main story was more of a linear line that had a few branches coming out, but conversely, the story you're going to experience in Cyberpunk 2077, those branches will grow into other branches, but also tie back in. And this is something we've really heard about in the past, how certain side quests will affect some of the main story. So really with Cyberpunk, you're seeing way more of an emphasis on that replayability, different options, different avenues for you to complete certain tasks. And even further with this, it was clarified how the shorter aspect was only really for the main story. The Witcher 3's main story may be a little bit longer than Cyberpunk's, but that's not when taking into account some of the side quests or other side missions in Cyberpunk. Even further, as far as an explicit example of some of the variability or choice you will have in this game, they describe how certain locations will have certain restrictions. This may be in accessibility, it may be in how explorable it is. Like if you're one build, maybe you can't access certain areas. Some of those options will be locked behind certain paths or certain choices. And although this may be true for subsets of certain areas, it was described how in Cyberpunk overall, there's not going to be certain regions that are just locked off. Most of the world space will be accessible, and you're not going to have to complete this specific mission to gain access to the second part of the world, which I definitely like as someone who personally hates that kind of mechanic. But as far as the end of Cyberpunk goes, after you do finish that main story, it is described how there is something pretty cool going on with the post-game. After you beat the game, you can continue playing. They didn't actually share any details on what exactly this is, but it's described how they came up with something particularly cool and that they're excited for us to see it. As far as the world overall does go though, it is described how we'll only have one apartment, but our apartment will have some variation. The look and feel of it will vary a bit depending on which life path we pick at the beginning of the game. There's kind of a bit of our backstory where we came from in our character, but even further, the apartment will evolve over time. And also that there will be certain methods for us to express our personality in our apartment. Even though we only get one, it's not like you're totally restricted in how it looks. And in the past, it has been described how V's apartment actually does really provide itself as a focal point for the story, and that is one of the reasons that it actually is just this one singular apartment. Although conversely, something that there will be a variety of is vehicles. They describe how they're actually shooting to have more realistic car physics in Cyberpunk 2077 than Grand Theft Auto. I don't know if that's an anecdote that was actually said by the developers or it's just the poster kind of interpreting it to say that they want more realism than that other game, but either way, it seems like overall they want fairly realistic car physics. They don't want it to be an arcade racing game where you could do whatever, whenever. There also will be a car racing minigame, although it won't be super traditional. It will have a cyberpunk twist on it, but also a bit of an evolving or changing world was described, how a day-night cycle will actually affect gameplay. For example, depending on what time of day it is, there may be more or less guards at a location. At nighttime, sometimes you may find the guards sleeping, making sneaking around or gaining access a bit easier. Even further, the day-night cycle will have an impact on story scenes, although it's not really described how exactly that'll occur. Conversely, the game will have dynamic weather, and although it won't have as large of an impact as the day-night cycle, there will be things like when it's raining, the NPCs will pull out umbrellas, so it will be a somewhat reactive world. But speaking of a reactive world, we also hear about the police in this game and how reactive they'll be. It's described that the police won't respond to all crimes. If you're committing a pettier crime, and actually the example given for this was beating some dude up, the police won't react because that's just typical Night City happenings. You don't exactly live in the best place in the world. But if you do something more egregious like pulling out weapons or running people over, the police will respond to you and definitely take action. As far as combat and destruction does go, it was described how you could destroy roughly 3/4 of the assets around you, but you can't really destroy an entire district. You can't level a city to the ground. We've seen quite a bit of this destruction in both of the gameplays that have dropped around this game, and I actually think it's a pretty cool aspect of this that isn't getting a ton of attention. Even further, although there's not too many details shared, it is described how you can take a route in the story where you really burn the city down, kind of similar to how Johnny Silverhand does describe in one of the trailers. Cyberpunk 2077 will feature romance scenes, and they actually said that they did motion capture work for these romance scenes, and that they want to satisfy everyone. They don't expand on that too much, but that definitely could be an interesting rabbit hole to get down. But hey, I'm happy we're getting attention to detail almost everywhere. But even further, as far as modding tools and future functionality with this game, it's described how they do want to add mod support for Cyberpunk 2077, but at least at this stage of development, it's not something they're ready to commit to or declare as a feature. And then one final extra bonus thing that did pop up over the past couple of weeks. As we heard earlier in this video, we know that localization is currently occurring for Cyberpunk, and we heard from Luca Ward, who is the Italian voice actor for Johnny Silverhand, that he had his lines nearly doubled, seemingly because Keanu Reeves took such an interest in Cyberpunk 2077, he sought to have a greater role. So if you liked Keanu Reeves or you like Johnny Silverhand, there seemingly will be quite a bit of them, quite a bit more than we expected even previously. But with all that being said, that is a recap at some of the recent happenings and news. Hopefully you guys found this video informative. I'm really excited for this game as we hear more and more in the way of details. It just continues to build my hype. Still within reason, I don't want to hype it up to the point where it can't meet those expectations, but the world of this one just seems like it's going to be something that is a lot of fun to explore and then explore again and again on subsequent playthroughs. Either way, with all of that being said, I thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, but with that, I hope to see you all next time. Later.